The day had begun with a quiet hope that perhaps, after so many years of sacrifice and silent toil, there would be a moment to rest in the warmth of family appreciation. I remember sitting at the head of the table, the familiar creak of the wooden chair beneath me serving as a steady pulse in a room filled with voices I once trusted. The table was laden with dishes, each carefully prepared, each meant to celebrate my years of hard work, not just as a financial analyst, but as a husband, father, and grandfather who had shaped this family's very foundation. I looked around, expecting smiles, gratitude lingering in their eyes like I'd seen so many times before, but what I found instead were cold gazes and barely concealed disdain. My son and daughter spoke loudly, their words cutting through the air with precision, like knives honed on years of unspoken grievances, or worse, entitlement. They called me a beggar, begging for respect, for acknowledgement, for a place in their lives as more than a source of funds. It was as if the decades of my quiet sacrifices were invisible, as if the countless nights spent balancing budgets and securing their futures amounted to nothing but a joke in their eyes. My mouth went dry, the salt of humiliation burning in my throat, but my face remained still, carefully blank. I could feel the tremor behind my ribs, the blood pounding in my temples, threatening to explode with heat, but I sat mute, determined to endure the storm in silence. Their voices gained volume, the insults stacking like bricks pushed into a wall of decency that I tried and failed to maintain. I had built this home with my own hands, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, yet I was now being treated like a stranger, a trespasser in the life and house I had provided. Their spouses, equally cold and complicit, joined in, their laughter sharp as broken glass. What stung most was not the words themselves, but the cruelty that lay beneath them, the way they dismissed all the years I had poured myself into their well-being, as if love could be measured by a paycheck, as if loyalty was a transaction. Something in me cracked that night, not like glass shattering all at once, but like a slow, deep fracture that runs beneath the surface, silent, unseen, waiting to split open at the perfect moment. I rose from my seat, the room spinning slightly, but my hands were steady, my voice absent, my heart a coiled spring. They expected pain, tears, anger. I gave them none. Instead, I slipped out of the house, away from the laughter and scorn, away from the faces that had transformed from beloved family to venomous enemies. The cold night air bit into my skin, but it felt cleaner, more honest than the warmth inside that had turned to ice. I walked without looking back, letting the darkness swallow the sharp edges of betrayal that cut deeper than any words could reach. As the door closed behind me, a different kind of fire began to grow, not one of anger, but of resolve. I was not broken. I was not defeated. In those quiet, endless minutes of walking away, the seeds of vengeance took root. They did not need to know the storm I was gathering. They believed they had stripped me of all power. They were wrong. The man who sat at that table, humiliated and cast aside, was only the first act in a play they would soon regret starring in. The calm after the storm was not for forgiveness. It was the silence before a reckoning, and I was already preparing my return. Later that night, in the solitude of my dimly lit study, I sank into an old leather chair, the weight of the day pressing upon me like a relentless storm. Outside, the city whispered in shadows, the distant murmur of engines, the occasional wail of sirens, but none of it reached me. I was enveloped by a silence far more suffocating, one that echoed the emptiness left by those closest to me. My gaze rested on a worn photograph of my late wife, her gentle smile frozen in time. Her soft voice, ingrained in my memory, offered the only comfort in those endless hours. Patience, forgiveness, and strength are our pillars, Harold. Never forget. Those words, so often spoken and so rarely heeded by my own flesh and blood, filled my thoughts as I ventured back through the corridors of memory. Each recollection etched deep wounds alongside fortifying resolve. I pictured all the nights I spent hunched over ledgers, the fatigue so intense it sometimes blurred my vision, yet I pressed on. Every sacrificed hour, every missed dinner, every untold worry about late payments was part of an unspoken promise to shield my family from hardship, to craft a secure home where my children and grandchildren could flourish without fear. Yet, as fresh as the wounds felt, what pierced me most sharply was the realization that all those sacrifices dissolved into nothingness in the eyes of the very people I'd raised. My daughter's bitter words, my son's dismissive smirks, the callous laughter shared among their spouses. It was a chorus of disdain drowning out every act of love. They treated me as a beggar pleading for scraps of respect, as though my decades of devotion were mere bills to be paid without gratitude. The home I'd built with my own hands was now a theater for their scorn, a stage where I was both outcast and enemy. Sitting there, wrapped in the cold night's quiet, I allowed myself a moment to feel the depths of that betrayal. My chest ached, a raw physical pain that transcended words. The sting was not just in their accusations, but in the utter absence of the bond I thought we shared. Yet, alongside that pain, an ember of something else ignited, something more enduring than grief.
I realized then that no amount of sadness would repair the fracture between us. Patience would not mend entitlement. Forgiveness would only sanction disrespect. And so, beneath the weariness, a different fire took hold. A relentless will to reclaim what was mine, not through tears or pleading, but through measured, unyielding resolve. The expertise I had honed in a lifetime as a financial analyst began to stir in my mind. The years of methodical number crunching, of parsing complex contracts with relentless scrutiny, were not distant relics, but powerful tools laying quietly in wait. I envisioned myself once again poring over pages of bank statements with a keen eye, uncovering anomalies and hidden debts. I recalled the intricate clauses buried deep within property deeds, legal nuances that most overlooked, but that I had always understood could tip the scales.
My sense of purpose sharpened as I revisited the sacrifices behind each dollar, a precarious balance of payments made on time, debts set to zero, accounts carefully managed to protect the family's future. Not one of those sacrifices would go unaddressed. They had mistaken my silence for weakness, my kindness for submission. But I was neither weak nor broken. I was a man who understood the games played in shadowed boardrooms and knew that power is rarely won by noise. It is claimed with quiet patience and relentless precision. As dawn crept over the horizon, bathing the city in muted light, I stood by the window and watched a new world slowly take shape. The home I had built stood firm, silent and resolute, as if it bore witness to every laughter lost and every promise broken within its walls. I did not yet know all the moves I would make, but I understood the path ahead was long and fraught with peril. Still, I was ready to translate betrayal into balance, to turn cold calculation into justice, to ensure that respect and dignity would no longer be mere hopes, but realities reclaimed. The children I had cherished, now strangers draped in greed, believed they had stripped me of everything. But as the city stirred to life, I felt the awakening within myself. A man transformed from humbled provider into a strategist quietly gathering strength. The reckoning would not come with a roar, but with the steady, unrelenting pressure of truth and consequence. They had mistaken patience for frailty, neglect for forgetfulness. Soon they would learn that justice is earned, arrogance corrected, and dignity restored, not with empty words, but with actions measured and sure. My hands, those same hands that had once soothed and built, would now steady the scales of balance. The night had tested me, and I had survived with the calm heartbeat of resolve. The seeds of that night's resolve were planted deep within me, growing fierce and unyielding. I was no beggar. I was a man ready to reclaim his right, his home, and his name. Weeks passed, each like the steady tick of a clock marking the slow buildup of something inevitable. Outwardly, I remained the same figure they had dismissed, the quiet, aging man seemingly resigned to his fate. But inside, I was beginning to awaken from a long, subdued slumber, my mind sharpening like a blade forged in fire. That call, the one that shattered any illusions, replayed relentlessly in my head. My children, those I raised and sacrificed for, were draining my accounts, stealing what belonged to me behind the pretense of care and familial responsibility. The sting was deep, cold, a betrayal that cut past words and into the very core of my being. Yet, beneath the initial shock, something else began to grow, an unyielding determination tempered by decades of experience. I knew better than to be consumed by rage or blind fury. The man they had humiliated was gone. In his place stood a strategist, one whose understanding of finance, law, and human nature had been honed over a lifetime. I was not a victim, but a calculated force ready to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The room where I worked was strewn with papers, bank statements, loan contracts, investment portfolios, all familiar and yet now charged with new significance. I pored over each document meticulously, my eyes trained to spot discrepancies, unauthorized transactions, and hidden liabilities. There were loans taken in my name without my consent, sudden withdrawals from accounts I thought untouched, debts accumulated in shadows I had never authorized. They had been feeding on my trust, their greed cloaked in the guise of family patronage, while I remained ignorant. I traced every transaction, every balance, like a detective following footprints. Patterns emerged, revealing a network of deception woven tightly but not without flaws. The very skills I had used to unravel corporate frauds now illuminated the path of personal justice. My mind raced with plans, contingencies, and what-ifs. Each discovery strengthened my resolve, proving that their arrogance could be undone by patience and strategy. I reached out quietly to old allies, lawyers specializing in banking and property law, trusted friends from my professional life who owed me favors or indebtedness. Our conversations were cautious, circumspect, cloaked in the language of business disputes. This was a fight that had to be waged in shadows, unseen by those who believed my silence was submission. I was careful to maintain my facade of calm at home, interacting with my children as if unaware of the storm gathering just beneath the surface. Their smug confidence, this toxic mixture of entitlement and ignorance, would be their greatest weakness. In every legal text and financial ledger I reviewed, I searched for the smallest advantage, buried clauses in mortgage documents, rights reserved in investment contracts, and dormant liens waiting to be invoked. Slowly, I pieced together a mosaic of defenses and weapons that could be wielded when the time came. Assets held solely in my name, the house, some unencumbered investments, became my fortress, the foundation from which I could mount a counterstrike. When I uncovered evidence of loans taken out without my approval, I felt a mix of disgust and fierce resolve. These were not accidental miscalculations, but deliberate acts of exploitation. Yet rather than reaction, I responded with silent, clinical action. Payments were stopped where possible. Liens on properties were quietly initiated. Legal counsel was brought into the fold discreetly to prepare the necessary paperwork. I moved like a shadow across the chessboard, positioning every piece for maximum effect without revealing my intentions. Nights blurred into early mornings as I burned the midnight oil, dissecting each contract, recalculating finances, and ensuring every angle was covered. The protective clauses, once dismissed as legal jargon, now glowed with strategic importance. For the first time in many years, I felt the surge of purpose beneath my skin, the exhilaration of a battle waged with intellect and precision rather than brute force. This was not about personal vengeance. It was about reclaiming justice. They had stolen not just money, but respect, trust, and the legacy we were meant to share. I was determined to restore the balance, not through anger or rashness, but through unwavering resolve and the cold logic that had shaped my career. There were moments of solitude where the weight of betrayal pressed heavily, moments when the loneliness of this path threatened to overwhelm. Yet those were fleeting, drowned by the steady echo of my wife's voice in my heart, calling for strength and patience. No mercy would be granted to those who had betrayed me, but justice, true justice, would be served. With every passing day, I shed the skin of the wounded father and donned the armor of the relentless strategist. I anticipated their moves, plotted several steps ahead, and built layers of protection. The arrogance of my children blinded them to the fact that I was no longer a passive victim, but a force gathering strength in silence. They mistook my patience for weakness and my silence for forgetfulness. But the truth is, patience can be the deadliest weapon, and silence the loudest roar when the moment finally arrives. I stood on the brink of a reckoning, a calculated, inevitable confrontation that would expose deceit, reassert control, and restore what should never have been lost. This was my life's work, my legacy, and my dignity. It was a battle not just for assets, but for respect long denied. And so I waited, calmly and confidently, steadying my hands, the same hands that once built, that once soothed, to now right the wrongs inflicted upon me. The man who left that dinner table broken was no more. I was reborn as the guardian of my legacy, relentless, patient, and unyielding. The game had changed, and I was ready to win. I poured myself into those documents as if they were sacred texts, the lifeblood of everything I had built. Each line of ink, every stamp and signature was more than mere bureaucracy. It was a ledger of sacrifice, a history etched in numbers and contracts. Night after night, I sat at my desk, the light low and steady, combing through financial statements, deeds, loan agreements, and tax returns with the thoroughness of a man seeking justice. The precision I had honed over a lifetime in financial analysis was now my shield and sword. As my eyes scanned the pages, the truth unfolded before me. Old debts I thought long paid had resurfaced like ghosts, their shadows stretching across my holdings. Unauthorized loans had been taken out in my name. Interest compounded quietly while I was blinded by trust. Taxes went unpaid, piling up in dark corners of the ledgers. Each discovery was a fresh wound, a betrayal far deeper than I could have imagined. But this knowledge, sharp as it was, gave me clarity. While they had hidden their greed behind polite smiles and false reassurances, I saw every crack they left exposed. They were careless in their arrogance, and I would exploit every oversight. I dived deeper into contracts signed years ago, unearthing minute clauses and obscure legal language forgotten by many but ingrained in my memory. The complex dance of banking regulations, property law, and trust management, once the sleepy parts of my career, now burned brightly as my arsenal. These technicalities were weapons waiting to be wielded in the fight to reclaim control. My mind traced the contours of these documents, mapping out strategies to challenge their attempts to siphon from what I had built. At the same time, I quietly reached out to old allies, lawyers whose skills had been tested alongside mine, retired colleagues who respected my dedication and owed me favors. Our meetings were shrouded in discretion, pragmatic conversations filled with legal jargon and veiled hints. In them, I found renewed strength. I was no longer isolated by betrayal. Together, we prepared to dismantle the helter-skelter web of deceit that had extended beneath my own roof. Family gatherings became a stage of painful pretenses. Their confidence was deafening. Each smirk, every casual insult underscored their belief that my fortune and legacy were theirs by entitlement. They laughed and looked past me, oblivious to the quiet storm raging in my mind. I met their provocations with polite smiles, my voice controlled, my gaze steady. They did not see the intensity burning behind my calm exterior, the details and plans consolidating with every passing day. I identified every asset under my name, the properties held carefully in my own trust, investments untouched by their hands, accounts secured through years of foresight. These were my final bastions, islands in a sea of betrayal. With vigilance, I scoured recent amendments in banking and property law, discovering changes that had slipped through the cracks, potential leverage points if I employed them correctly. The law was my maze, and I was rediscovering its pathways with the confidence of one who had mastered them. With meticulous effort, I unearthed financial damages inflicted without my permission, unauthorized loans hidden in the edges of statements, credit lines extended under false pretenses, debts that could topple the fragile structure of what I owned. Yet, for every blow I found, I plotted countermeasures, halting payments covertly, activating liens where applicable. Preserve the original language of the text through legal channels. Every maneuver was precise, designed to cause maximum impact without warning or premature alarm. Throughout this period, I maintained a composed exterior. I knew revealing the breadth of my discovery was to give them a strategic advantage. I attended family events with a quiet dignity, interacting with the very people who had scorned me as though nothing had changed. Their arrogance grew, unchallenged on the surface. Yet beneath my calm facade, the cold pressure of calculated moves and legal strategies suffused every action. Loneliness hung over me like a shadow in the silent hours. Bitter revelations about family could not be escaped easily. But amid the solitude, my wife's remembered voice was a balm, quiet yet firm. Justice is patience, Harold. Justice is strength. Those words calmed the darker urges that might have led me to impulsiveness or despair. I remembered that justice was the answer, not vengeance, but restoration. The text, I shed the role of the wounded father, crafting instead the vigilance of a relentless strategist. I mapped out their every likely response, built defensive layers, and prepared for resistance. Their pride and greed were my adversaries, but they were blind to the transformation underway. They treated my quiet endurance as meekness, my silence as oblivion. But I knew that patience is often the deadliest weapon, and silence the loudest shout. At the precipice of confrontation, I felt no animosity or chaos, only the cold resolve of inevitability. This was not merely a fight for property or wealth, it was for respect. Respect dismissed too long, trust violated by those closest to me. My dignity demanded restoration. Each day's precise actions moved me closer to reclaiming what had been taken. My hands that had built the house, that had soothed and guided, now steadied the scales of justice. The long night of betrayal had forged in me a new self, stronger and more determined than ever before. I rose not with the cries of anger, but with the quiet certainty of a man armed with knowledge and unwavering purpose. This was a battle of wits and patience, and I would see it through to the end. My home, the fortress I had erected over decades, was the foundation of my fight. I stood as its guardian, its rightful steward, ready to reclaim what was theirs only in delusion. The echoes of boardroom battles years ago now reverberated in this personal war, underscored by the enduring truths of loyalty and justice. Behind a calm mask, I prepared, studied, and waited for just the right moment. They believed my endurance was frailty, my silence ignorance. Soon, they would be confronted not only with the facts, but with the true strength of a man who had been wronged but refused to resign. They had stacked the deck with arrogance and assumed the game was theirs, but the pieces were turning. Piece by piece, move by calculated move, the foundation of their false security was beginning to erode, replaced by the slow, unstoppable resurgence of justice. This was the reckoning I had promised myself, a reckoning both just and inevitable. I was ready, not as the broken man who had left that dinner table, but as the guardian reborn, steady, patient, and unyielding. The time to reclaim my legacy, my dignity, and my home had arrived. And when the moment came, it would be decisive, absolute, and without mercy for those who betrayed me. The calm before the storm settled over the house like a heavy, suffocating fog. I moved through the rooms once filled with laughter and light, now shadowed by unspoken tensions and the suffocating weight of betrayal. The very walls of the home I built with my own hands seemed to echo the silence, a grim reminder that the sanctuary I had created was no longer a refuge, but a battleground. Quietly, I set my plan into motion. The first fractures appeared beneath their feet like unseen tremors. I began by severing the financial lifelines they had so comfortably exploited. Payments halted in secret, dormant liens invoked with methodical care. Ownership papers dusted off and wielded with authority. Each action was like a chess move executed with surgical precision, designed to unsettle but not alarm prematurely. Days turned into weeks as I watched the comfortable bubble my children lived in begin to waver. Their once unshakable certainty dissolved into a simmering panic they couldn't express. Eviction notices, silent but devastating, arrived without warning, delivered with the cold courtesy of a man long wronged but newly empowered. Letters from lawyers, formal yet unyielding, piled up in their hands, dismantling the illusion that their complacency would protect them. The confrontations that followed were volcanic eruptions of anger and desperation. I faced their snarls and pleas with a calm so profound it unsettled them deeper than any shout might have. My eyes revealed nothing but the steady resolve of a man who had been patient too long, whose silence was not weakness but a weapon sharpened by years of betrayal. I said only what was necessary, precise, measured words that cut through their defenses and left no room for debate. They accused me of cruelty, of coldness, but they failed to understand that this was justice caged in calm resolve. Each moment of silence I held was a statement louder than any outburst. The house, the legacy, the dignity they had dismissed were slipping from their grasp. The fortress they believed impenetrable was unraveling. Watching them lose their footing was bittersweet. The pride they once wore so casually was replaced by frantic attempts to salvage what they could. Offers of negotiation behind closed doors, promises whispered and then broken, the desperate grasping at control, all gestures that only confirmed the depth of their fear. They had made their bed with greed and entitlement. Now they had to lie in the consequences. I remained distant from their chaos, a spectator to the collapse of the empire they had tried to seize. My calm was deliberate, a stark contrast to their unraveling turmoil. I recognized in their desperation the final admission of their failures to honor the sacrifices made for them, failures to respect the man who had provided for generations. In the still moments between confrontations, I reflected on the journey that brought me here. The tears I never shed at that dreadful dinner, the sleepless nights balancing ledgers and life, the hopes pinned on family loyalty, all culminated in this effort to reclaim what was eroded by deceit. It was no longer just about assets or titles. It was about restoring order to a life turned chaotic by betrayal. The weight of solitude was heavy, but resolute hearts bear such burdens with quiet strength. I found solace in the knowledge that fairness demanded action, that dignity required standing firm even when the path was lonely. The house itself bore witness to the struggle. It had cradled us through better days, and now stood sentinel as justice was restored. In moments of quiet, I heard the echo of my wife's voice, a whisper carried on the winds of memory, reinforcing the resolve I clung to. She had taught me the power of patience and the strength found in measured response. This was her legacy as much as mine, a legacy I was now determined to honor by reclaiming the peace and respect that had been stolen. With every day, the threads of my plan tightened around the truth, suffocating the false security they had woven. Each move, each document served as a blade slowly severing their grip on what they never rightfully owned. I wielded the law not as a weapon of vengeance, but as an instrument of justice, one that balanced the scales that had long been tipped against me. Their world, once so comfortable and privileged, was crumbling beneath the weight of accountability. I watched as their desperation evolved, first disbelief, then anger, finally resignation, as the reality of their choices dawned on them. They came with threats veiled in frustration, appeals cloaked in false remorse. But I stood unmoved, a pillar of calm inevitability. The most telling moments came when they realized the depth of their isolation. The alliances they had expected to hold faltered. Friends reduced contact. Whispers of their duplicity spread quietly. The fortress of support they had counted on was no longer theirs. The echo of their pleas faded into silence as the legal mechanisms I had set in motion closed around them. Throughout this unfolding drama, I never lost sight of my purpose. This was no petty squabble, but a decisive reclaiming of respect. A reassertion of dignity stolen by greed masked as entitlement. Each document reviewed, each lien filed, each carefully worded notice sent was a testament to the life I had built and the sacrifices made along the way. The strategy I employed was methodical and relentless, a reflection of the man I'd become through pain and perseverance. The house, once a home filled with warmth and laughter, had become the stage for a quiet revolution, a reclaiming of power, ownership, and respect. Now, when I walked its halls, I felt not the sting of abandonment, but the steady pulse of restored control. The echoing silence of those who once occupied its rooms spoke volumes, not of loss only, but of the inevitable justice served. I had not sought confrontation. It found me, drawn by the demands of truth and honor. But I met it not with rage, but with the steady hand of experience and the unshakable will of a man who refused to be forgotten. The house, my fortress, was slipping from their grasp. They had believed it untouchable, but the tides of justice do not heed arrogance or entitlement. And as the final notices landed, as the key rights to their occupancy were revoked with deliberate calm, I felt the first true measure of peace since that night of humiliation. This was not revenge. It was the restoration of dignity, of order, and of the respect so cruelly denied. The war was far from over, but this victory, quiet, precise, and unwavering, was mine. The house breathed again under my care, fortified not just by bricks and mortar, but by the unwavering justice I had reclaimed. I stood firm not just as a man restoring property rights, but as a guardian of legacy, ensuring that the sacrifices of a lifetime were honored and protected. In the unfolding chapters that lay ahead, I would remain vigilant, calm, and resolute. The foundation was secured, and the balance was tipping. This was the moment when power returned to where it had always belonged. The family gathered once more, but the energy in the room was nothing like the warmth or celebration of years past. Instead, a heavy tension hung in the air, like the silent before a storm breaking. A storm I had been patiently preparing for all along. Faces once filled with smug entitlement were now etched with anxiety, disbelief, as if reality was crashing down faster than they could cope with. The walls that had echoed with laughter now seemed to hang silent, heavy with the weight of unspoken regrets and truths long ignored. I took my seat deliberately at the head of the table, my posture calm, my gaze steady. The man who had once been humiliated no longer sat there as a broken figure. He was a man reborn, steadied by patience, fortified by resolve. I began to systematically lay out the evidence that had accumulated, piece by painstaking piece, like a jigsaw puzzle revealing a damning portrait. Bank statements with unauthorized withdrawals blazed proof of their deception. Contracts whispered of loans taken out under my name without consent, debts that I neither sanctioned nor benefited from. Legal notices, served with quiet authority, punctuated the narrative with finality. They were irrefutable, and for once the truth was unassailable. Their reactions shifted like a tide. First shock, then denial, followed by an unsettled anger that quickly dissolved into shame. Eyes avoided my gaze, faces flushed with the discomfort of exposure. The shield of arrogance they have wielded for so long was splintering beneath the relentless clarity of facts. The bravado that once filled the room was replaced by an uneven silence, a recognition that the foundation of lies was crumbling beneath their feet. I did not raise my voice or hurl accusations. My tone was even, my words weighted with years of sacrifice and quiet strength. I spoke not to punish but to restore, to remind them of the bonds they had broken, of the dignity they had dismissed. Respect, I told them, is not owed but earned through honesty and grace, qualities so absent in their actions. The evidence spread before them was more than financial. It was a mirror reflecting their own betrayals back onto them. Some turned away, unwilling to face the man whose trust they had shattered. Others sat rigid, the weight of shame rooting them in place. Words of regret were few, spoken in hushed tones or not at all. The silence, heavy and resolute, seemed more fitting than any apology. As I detailed how they had siphoned from accounts, exploited goodwill, and attempted to undermine everything I had built, a deep release settled within me. This was not just restitution of assets, but the reclamation of identity and legacy. The generations past, including my beloved wife who had long since passed, deserved this justice. Through firm but fair judgment, I was restoring more than property. I was restoring the moral fabric of our family. What followed was a mixture of broken pleas, veiled threats, and hollow promises, all failing to pierce my calm resolve. I met each with equanimity, unshaken by theatrics or desperate attempts at manipulation. My power lay in truth and steadiness, virtues honed through years of personal and professional trials. I understood that true strength does not roar. It endures and prevails through measured action. When the meeting finally concluded, a heavy silence lingered in the space that moments before had been charged with confrontation. I sat back, absorbing the quiet affirmation of a victory earned not in spectacle, but in the patient accumulation of facts and the unwavering will to see justice done. Power had been restored, quietly, profoundly, and irrevocably. In the weeks that followed, the house that had borne witness to family conflict seemed to inhale anew. The weight of discord lifted slightly, replaced by an atmosphere of accountability and clarity. Where once entitlement reigned, there was now a sober recognition of consequence and responsibility. The walls, silent observers of both joy and betrayal, stood testament to what had been lost and what was being painstakingly rebuilt. Though estranged, the family could no longer deny the cost of their choices. The web of deceit had been untangled, and the consequences crafted by their own hands fell squarely upon them. I bore no triumph in their downfall, only a solemn assurance that fairness, delayed but not denied, had been served. During solitary moments, I reflected on the bitter lessons life had impressed upon me with relentless force. Justice, I recalled, is not synonymous with mercy. It is the restoration of balance, the correction of wrongs with courage and resolve. It demands patience, intellect, and, above all, the willingness to stand firm even when surrounded by the ruins of trust. As dusk settled softly over the home I had reclaimed, I looked out upon a future unburdened by hollow ties and false gratitude. The man who had once fled in humiliation had been transformed, serene, steady, and triumphant. Whispering to the fading light, I affirmed a truth hard learned but deeply held. Dignity reclaimed is freedom earned. The war had not been waged with clamor or fury, but with steady endurance and unwavering conviction. The legacy, though scarred, stood strong as a monument to sacrifice, perseverance, and ultimate justice. As night deepened, I embraced the peace that comes only when respect, power, and truth are restored to their rightful place. In the quiet that followed, the house seemed to breathe again, exhaling years of tension and pain. The walls, once heavy with conflict and disappointment, now held a softer presence, a silence filled not with absence, but with the gentle pulse of restoration. Walking through the rooms, I felt the weight of history settle into something new, not the burden of betrayal, but the promise of renewal. Every scratch on the floorboards, every faded photograph, echoed with memories, but those echoes were no longer defined by loss. They bore witness to endurance and hope. The family that had once filled this space felt distant now, their presence reduced to ghosts of shared pasts. We were separated by more than just physical distance. There was a chasm carved by choices made and respect so callously discarded. They paid the price of their actions, and while there was no joy in their downfall, I felt a solemn relief knowing that justice, even delayed, had found its course. No longer would deceit and entitlement overshadow the legacy my wife and I worked so hard to create. During the long, solitary hours, I found myself revisiting the lessons life had carved deeply into my spirit. Justice, I realized, is seldom an act of mercy. It is the careful balancing of scales, a restoration of order amidst chaos. It demands strength not just to fight, but to endure. To stand steadfast when surrounded by the ruins left by those who once shared your trust. It calls for patience, clarity, and the courage to hold firm even when the path grows lonely and fraught with disappointment. This was the hard-won wisdom I carried now, a torchlight guiding me through the aftermath. My wife's quiet voice often rose in my memory during those moments, a calm balm reminding me of the strength found not in fury but in measured resolve. Her belief in the power of patience and the quiet assertion of truth became the foundation upon which I rebuilt not just my home but myself. What had been stripped away by greed and betrayal was now being reclaimed through perseverance and unwavering conviction. The future stretched out before me, free from the entanglements of false promises and hollow gratitude. I was a man transformed, no longer the broken figure who had once fled from the humiliation of betrayal, but one renewed through the fires of hardship. Gazing out at the fading twilight, I whispered a creed both simple and profound. Dignity reclaimed is freedom earned. It was a truth that carried the weight of every sacrifice, every hard lesson learned along the way. This was not a victory marked by loud proclamations or hollow celebrations. Rather, it was the steady, enduring calm that comes from justice patiently wrought. The scars left behind by years of sacrifice and betrayal remained, but they served as symbols of survival and resilience, a monument to a legacy preserved against all odds. As dusk deepened into night and the house settled into a quiet peace, I embraced the tranquility that follows the restoration of truth and honor. Power had been returned to its rightful place, not through vengeance, but through the quiet strength of a man who refused to be diminished. The legacy I guarded stood firm, strengthened by the very trials it had endured. In the stillness, I found a peace deeper than any I had known before. The peace that arises when respect is restored, when wrongs are righted, and when a life built on sacrifice is honored once again. The journey had been long and lonely, fraught with moments of pain and doubt, but in the end, I stood unbroken, steady in the certainty that I had reclaimed not just my home, but my dignity and my freedom.